Tarantino has seen more movies than you. That's not an insult, it's just a fact. The guy ran a video store, lived in a theater, and still watches 3 movies a day. So when he calls a movie a masterpiece or says it's one of the best ever made, you listen, even if that movie was a box office flop so disastrous, it nearly killed the studio. Brian De Palma was on a hot streak. Carrie, Dressed to Kill, Scarface, and then Blowout happened. Budgeted at $18 million, it only made $13.7 million at the box office, and that was it. The movie flopped. But here's the thing, Tarantino absolutely loves it. He calls it some of Brian De Palma's finest filmmaking and even goes as far as saying it's one of the greatest films ever made because Brian De Palma is one of the finest directors of his generation. It's a weird, violent film, part conspiracy thriller, part horror movie, and just an all-out celebration of cinematic suspense. It stars John Travolta as a movie sound man who accidentally records a murder, and from there, things spiral into full-on paranoia. Tarantino actually credits Blowout as the movie that made him cast Travolta in Pulp Fiction. Without Blowout, no Vincent Vega. And of course, that led to Travolta's big comeback. Oscar nomination, career revitalization, the whole thing. Back in the 2000s, Tarantino made a list of his 20 favorite movies from 1992 to 2009. Some of the picks make total sense. Battle Royale, Boogie Nights, The Host, all movies you can see Tarantino absolutely loving. But then there's Anything Else, a Woody Allen film with a 40% on Rotten Tomatoes. Look, I like Tarantino. I like Woody Allen. I even like Christina Ricci. But Anything Else just feels aggressively boring. The dialogue is surface level, the jokes feel recycled, and the acting is stiff. I actually re-watched it, tried to find something in it that made Tarantino love it, and I came up with nothing. And yet Tarantino wasn't alone. Roger Ebert actually gave it 3 out of 4 stars and praised the dialogue, saying, "At a time when so many American movies keep dialogue at a minimum so they can play better overseas. What a delight to listen to smart people whose conversation is like a kind of comic music." If you know anything about Tarantino, you know he loves revenge movies. And he doesn't just love Rolling Thunder, he named his entire distribution company after it. Written by Paul Schrader, Rolling Thunder feels like the grittier, more action-heavy cousin to Taxi Driver. It's a violent revenge thriller about a Vietnam vet hunting down the men who destroyed his life. And when I say violent, I mean violent. The film's climax is brutal, and at the time, it was controversial. The director John Flynn even said, "We almost got killed when we previewed Rolling Thunder in San Jose." People were shocked by the extreme violence, especially the scene where a hand is ground up in a garbage disposal unit. Critics dismissed it as mindless compared to Taxi Driver, but Schrader pushed back, saying, "Rolling Thunder was able to explore things we didn't touch on in Taxi Driver." And Tarantino completely agrees. He calls it ass-kicking nirvana and one of the great revenge thrillers. This one's legendary, but for all the wrong reasons. When Showgirls hit theaters in 1995, it didn't just flop, it crashed and burned. A $40 million budget, a box office haul that didn't even break even, and a reception so bad it pretty much ended Elizabeth Berkley's career overnight. Joe Esterhazy, the guy behind Basic Instinct, came up with the idea while vacationing in Maui. He literally scribbled it down on a napkin, sold the concept for $2 million, and that was that. Paul Verhoeven, known for RoboCop and Total Recall, took the director's chair, and what they made was a big-budget Hollywood movie that played like a sleazy B-movie. And that's exactly why Tarantino loves it. He's called it great with a capital great, because to him, Showgirls was a rare moment when a major studio actually bankrolled a full-blown exploitation film. He compared it to Mandingo in the 70s. This is a thriller about 4 desperate men hauling unstable dynamite through the jungle, and it flopped hard. It had the worst timing possible. Came out just 1 month after Star Wars, And when theaters replaced Star Wars with Sorcerer, audiences vanished. People wanted spaceships and laser battles, not 2 hours of sweaty, nerve-shredding suspense. It only made $9 million worldwide when it needed $45 million to break even. Tarantino, though, thinks it's one of the greatest thrillers of the 70s, and he's praised its practical effects, especially that now legendary rope bridge sequence. He's gone as far as to say it's one of his all-time favorite films, calling it an undersung masterpiece that deserved a better fate. And he's not alone. Francis Ford Coppola has also called it a forgotten classic. And even Stephen King once said, "Some may argue that the original Wages of Fear is better. I beg to disagree." But the best endorsement is Friedkin himself. When the film was restored in 2014, almost 40 years later, he introduced it by saying, "If I had the opportunity, I would change all of my films in one way or another. But not this one. Not Sorcerer. This is the one film that I made that I would not change a frame of." When The Thing hit theaters in 1982, just 2 weeks after Spielberg's Extraterrestrial, it bombed. Dead on arrival. Critics trashed it, audiences ignored it, and it flopped so hard that John Carpenter lost his next studio project because of it. But over time, the film's reputation completely flipped. It found its audience, built up a massive cult following, and is now widely considered one of the greatest horror movies ever made. And Tarantino's obsessed with it. He's talked about how rare it is for a horror movie to actually scare him, but The Thing did. It didn't just scare him, it inspired him. He said that when he was writing Reservoir Dogs, he wanted to capture that same feeling of paranoia. Trap these bastards in a warehouse, make them question each other, and let that tension build until it explodes. And later, when he made The Hateful Eight, he didn't just take inspiration. He actually used unused tracks from Ennio Morricone's score for The Thing. John Milius's Big Wednesday barely made a ripple at the box office. It was pulled from theaters almost immediately, only scraping together $4.5 million against an $11 million budget. And if you ask William Catt, who starred in the movie, that failure was all about bad marketing. He once said that the studio focused too much on the fights and the surfing, completely missing the heart of the story. But even though it bombed when it came out, over time, it's built a solid reputation as a hidden gem of the 70s. And Tarantino loves this movie, calls it the best surf film ever made, and even says that surfers don't deserve it. This one's a brutal revenge thriller out of Israel, and when Tarantino saw it, he didn't just like it. He called it the best film of the year. This was back in 2013 at the Busan International Film Festival, and out of everything he watched, this was the one he singled out. The film itself is a tough watch. It's about a father and a cop who decide to take justice into their own hands after a suspected child murderer avoids arrest. This is a very entertaining movie, if you can stomach the subject matter, with some truly excellent moments, but the tonal shifts seem a bit uneven because of how it mixes black comedy with some extremely dark stuff like torture. This one really bombed. Fandango was pulled from theaters after just a week, making a grand total of $91,000. Tarantino, though, loved it. He saw it 5 times in theaters during its 1-week run, and to this day he still swears by it. He once said Kevin Reynolds is going to be the Stanley Kubrick of this decade. Fandango is one of the best directorial debuts in the history of cinema. Obviously, Reynolds didn't exactly become Kubrick. After Waterworld flopped, he pretty much faded into the background. But Fandango itself is a cult classic now. The movie follows a group of college friends on one last road trip before they face adulthood, graduation, marriage, and even the draft for Vietnam. It was one of Kevin Costner's first major roles, and Spielberg himself backed the project after seeing Reynolds' original student film. But Warner Brothers had no clue how to sell it. They thought the unknown cast made it unreleasable, and by the time the film finally came out, they had already given up on it. Disney took a huge loss on The Lone Ranger, The budget was out of control, the press was bad before it even hit theaters, and westerns weren't exactly box office gold anymore. The film ended up costing the studio about $190 million in losses, one of the biggest write-offs in Hollywood history. But Tarantino actually backed this one. He put it on his personal top 10 of 2013. He thought the first 45 minutes were solid, the middle dragged, but that final train sequence? He loved it. He even said that while the film had its problems, people were way too quick to write it off. For Tarantino, this wasn't some unwatchable disaster. It was an old-school adventure movie with some of the best action filmmaking he'd seen in years.